Hello, everybody. Welcome to ROM. My name is Leela, and I'm the Chief of Collections Care as of 2 months ago. I'm delighted you could join us today for this program. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the ROM sits on the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg Nation, which includes the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation from time immemorial to today. Today's program is co-presented by ROM and the University of Toronto's Art Department, and I would like to thank them for their support and partnership throughout the development of today's talks. Every object tells a story, exploring the Bronze Age Aegean. It's been made possible through the support of the A.G. Leventis Foundation and the Republic of Greece, and I would like to personally express my gratitude on behalf of ROM for their ongoing support. A few housekeeping notes. Before we begin, please make sure that your phones and other devices are turned to silent. This afternoon, we will explore the material cultures of the Bronze Age Aegean through a series of 6 short talks, each followed by a short Q&A session. Full abstracts and bios are available in the printed handouts, as well as via download on the event page and on ROM's website. I encourage you to participate in the Q&A periods by using the microphones in each aisle. We'll have 2 breaks in the afternoon, a longer one after our first 2 talks for those who wish to have lunch or explore our galleries, and a coffee break later this afternoon. Unfortunately, Mr. Panayotis Anatonios, the Consul General of Greece in Toronto, is unable to join us today. He was, however, able to send his remarks, which I will share with you on his behalf. So please imagine me as a Greek man for the next 10 minutes. Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to address this important symposium on the Bronze Age and the Aegean. Upon reading the description of this program, I was instantly reminded of my days as a middle school student when I had my first contact with ancient Greek poetry. It was truly fascinating to study Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which recount the exploits of the Greek army that landed in Asia Minor and conquered Troy after a 10-year war, and respectively the travails of Odysseus, who survived the same war and spent another 10 years traveling until he managed to return to his home kingdom in Ithaca. Through these epic poems, I had the opportunity to be acquainted with the traditions, the civilization, and the social values and religion of the Greeks living in the Peloponnese and the Aegean Islands during the stages of the Bronze Age. I'm sure the distinguished speakers participating in this symposium will analyze many different aspects of life in this historical period. However, what I personally found most impressive is how many of those things people had in common with my modern compatriots. Whether it's the love of one's homeland, the value of friendship, the way we interpret life and death, or even the moral and psychological defects of the main characters of these heroic stories, all of these have been shaped by the Greek collective personality and ultimately make us who we are today. For all these reasons, today's symposium is particularly significant for me as the representative of Greece in Toronto. I wish to commend the Royal Ontario Museum for taking this important initiative. My particular acknowledgement goes to Paul Denis, curator for ancient Greece and Rome, with whom we've had an excellent cooperation in organizing events focused on ancient Greek civilization. Now that he is completing his tenure at ROM, I want to express my gratitude for all of the times we've worked together and wish him every success in his future endeavors. With these words, thank you all for being here today, and I wish you a successful and enlightening symposium. And now back to Leela. I hope you enjoy the afternoon with us. Our first speaker is Dr. Carl Knappett, Walter Graham Homer Thompson Chair of Aegean Prehistory at the University of Toronto. Dr. Knappett will be followed by Paul Denis, Rome Associate Curator for Ancient Greece and Rome. Please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you all here for this series of talks. Today, I would like to talk about this vase from the ROM's Aegean Gallery. I've chosen this one because this kind of vase is quite familiar to me from my archaeological fieldwork on the island of Crete. And I'll just show you where we are. So we're in the East Mediterranean. That is the island of Crete. And here's another image of the island. And I've put Knossos on there because I'm going to be talking about that site, which I'm just going to show you a couple of images of here. So the palace is the kind of beige bit right in the middle, and you have to imagine a quite substantial town spanning, a lot of this area all around it in this valley, and then the sprawling city of Heraklion over there in the distance, and the sea is about 5 kilometers away. So that just gives you a little bit of context, and here's another view of the Palace of Knossos, looking south towards the peak sanctuary of Yuktas, which is an important cult site in the Bronze Age. And back to this. It looks huge here, doesn't it? But it's only about this big. This kind of vessel is quite recognizable as an example of Kamares ware with its red and white paint on a black slip. There are many vases in this ware, first found more than 120 years ago in archaeological field work by scholars like Sir Arthur Evans. And here he is here. This type of pot we call a straight-sided cup because it's got, pretty straight sides. They're a little bit conical, really. And because of its vertical handle, this kind of nice handle, which looks like it would be useful for holding for drinking. One detail it has is a beveled base, which you can just see this little inclination there, this little angle there at the base, which happens to be quite a good chronological indicator of it being a late example in the Kamares ware repertoire. These decorative motifs that it has, particularly this retorted spiral at the upper body, is also a late feature. It's an example of the spiral band style with repeating S pattern at the base. All of which to say that this can be dated to what archaeologists call the Middle Minoan period, and specifically, and this gets a tiny bit nerdy, Middle Minoan 3A early, which is around 1700 BC. And this is exactly the period that I happen to have focused on myself in 2 books. Now, please don't take this as a plug. I'd be horrified if you went out and bought these very boring, very expensive volumes. So please don't do that. The one on the right is actually fairly recent, and it's really only for a handful of people. I mean, they sell about 6 copies worldwide. Yeah. So how do we date and place things like this? We rely on deposits of finds that are stratified in archaeological contexts to be able to establish what comes earlier and what comes later. And this is methodology that goes back way more than a century. And here we can see how Arthur Evans himself was quite concerned with it. He usually gets criticized for just kind of going after the treasures and not being too bothered by archaeological details. But that's not really true. He spent quite a lot of time trying to piece together, like, specifically where objects were found in relation to one another. And on the right is a particular section that he spent a lot of time going back and forth about and altering exactly where he thought these different kinds of objects were. And a lot of them are still available for study in what's called the Stratigraphical Museum at Knossos. And so archaeologists go and access these boxes and can go over this stuff and try and kind of reanalyze it. So with an individual piece just sitting in a museum in a case all by itself, we can slot it into an established sequence if we can recognize it. Even though we do not know for sure where it really came from, because all we know is that it was in a collection in Germany before the 1970s, we can be pretty sure stylistically and materially that it's from Crete. There's also a really good chance that it's actually from Knossos itself. However, things get a little more complicated here. This kind of ware also occurred in very similar styles at another central Cretan site with a palace, the Palace of Festos, which is here and has been excavated by the Italian school for 120 years. The styles are so similar that some archaeologists believe that many or all examples of this ware were actually made in the south at or near this site and imported to Knossos. So that would mean that they're being made down somewhere in the area around Festos and then exported up on donkeys or some means of transport up 40 or 50 kilometers to Knossos. Moreover, the clay fabrics, the actual material used in this kind of pottery, are very, very similar in the north and south. So you might think, well, surely, the geology is different. We can tell different sort of bits in the clay. Not really for the north and south. There's been lots of work on it, and it's really, really hard. So it's difficult distinguishing the two. So it's hard to rule out for certain that a vase found at one site was not made at the other. But it also seems likely that both Knossos and Festos made most of the wares they were using, with only a few examples of imports at either site. And this vase could, frankly, as easily be from Festos as Knossos. Anyway, arguing about is it from Festos, is it from Knossos, only really takes us so far. In any case, they are quite similar places in the Middle Bronze Age, or for much of the Middle Bronze Age. They are palaces with similar status. You can perhaps see that they both have these sort of central rectangular areas called central courts. They both have, on the left, they both have these west courts with raised walkways. They have wings with magazines arranged around the central court. Lots of things are really similar. And they're at a sort of similar scale as well. Actually, just when this cup is being made, all of that changes and Knossos becomes kind of the top dog. But for much of the Middle Bronze Age, they're very similar. So, what does it matter which place the cup comes from? I would like to say that maybe just as pertinent a question is what kind of context at either site the cup came from. Was it used in the palace proper at either site, or was it from a townhouse, or indeed in a burial? Such vessels do occur in all such contexts, which is in itself of some considerable interest. What do we think, then, that they were used for, these kinds of cups, given they can be found in such a range of find spots? Well, we think they're used for drinking, but what kind of drinking? Drinking in a palace is probably not the same as drinking in a regular kind of house or drinking at a funeral ceremony. If we just start with the palace, we do find, this is a kind of a plan of the palace which is kind of, I've sort of deliberately chosen this one to show the complexity of it. There's like so many rooms, and it's really hard kind of fitting it all on one slide. There's a real complexity to this place. If we just zoom in, anyway, on one part of the northeast corner, there's a deposit that Evans excavated called the Royal Pottery Stores. And there's quite a lot of cups. It's earlier, but quite a lot of cups of this kind stored and stacked in these stores. Obviously, the royal bit is a little bit of Evans kind of hyping it up a bit. But it's not very far away from the central court. And so one can imagine these cups kind of brought out and used in that communal area. We also find a lot of these kinds of cups of the relevant date dumped in these big kind of deposits near the West Court, just where I'm pointing at with the arrow there, in what's called the West Polychrome deposit. And it seems quite possible that such cups were brought out into the central court or the west court, which could have held hundreds and thousands of people, for use in public ceremonies that had some kind of feasting component. Now, archaeologists have been talking a lot about feasts for the last decade or two, and we tend to distinguish between those kinds of feasts that bring people together, creating solidarity, and those that are used to, show off and to display status, and for some people to have much nicer cups than other people. So what are we looking at with these kinds of cups? Well, on the one hand, they are some of the nicest ceramic vessels around. There were plenty more that are much less fine. These are the much denigrated conical cups, which people are always very rude about because they're, very crude and simply made with very few features. The drawings on the right to show the kind of some of the sort of rapidity of manufacture and how there are some there's just very little care taken over them because the idea is to sort of it's like the paper cup kind of thing. These things are mass produced for one-off use, so they're more carefully made than these. But on the other hand, there would also have been metal versions of such cups. We have silver drinking vessels. Not many preserved because they would have been so valuable, but it does look like here's one example that seems to belong to this period, this treasure from the Louvre called the Todd treasure. So where does our cup fit? It's not the conical cup, and it's not a silver cup, so we might say they're kind of middling rank. And so were they used in the palace accordingly, not by the upper echelons of the elite and not by the everyday villager or townsfolk, but sort of in between? It's possible. Cups like these are also found, though, in houses in the town. And so just one example is the Vlachachis plot, which was excavated about 15 years ago and published, and it's kind of in the village. Let's see if I can point this in the right direction. So here's the palace here, and there's one of the two villages next to the palace, and it's a plot in here. So this is part of the wider town of Knossos, some of which is underneath this village. But we're finding very similar, not identical, but very similar sorts of cups in houses. So we can't really talk about feasts in these kind of small houses. Such houses probably didn't have metal vessels on the whole. So these might have been the nicest cups for drinking in such contexts. And we also find them in burials. There's a strange fact, which is nobody seems to die at Knossos in this period. We have almost no burials. So they're very elusive. In earlier periods, they're visible. Later periods, very conspicuous. In this period, for some reason we don't understand, we can't find them. There's one I can really talk about with pottery of this kind. Also in the kind of up beyond the village in this area here on the hill slope, Monasteria Kokofali, which has some cups that are kind of similar. So we can point to some use of these kinds of vessels in these contexts, but we really need to go back down to the Mesara for slightly better examples, where we do have a really extensive assemblage of pottery like this from the Camellari tomb, which is here very close to Festos, so we're right back down here again. And we can see that there's lots and lots of cups, and the decoration isn't very clear, but these are the same sorts of things. You might be able to see the little beveled base on some of them. So this Tholos tomb, this round tomb, had a lot of pottery that's recently been restudied, and it looks like these kinds of cups could have been used in funerary feasts. So you're seeing a kind of variable a kind of use of this kind of vessel and a kind of flexibility to it, a kind of middling role. It's not the fanciest, but it's not the kind of crudest. Then maybe we can say that whatever was being consumed, and we always assume wine, we haven't really got a clear idea if that's actually the case, but we always assume wine. Maybe wine also had a kind of flexibility in how it was consumed. It could be used in funerary feasts, in palaces, and in everyday houses. It doesn't mean it's always wine. Actually, when we study Minoan pottery from this period, we get the impression that nobody was eating and just everybody was drinking all the time. There's hardly anything that we can say, oh yes, that's a nice bowl for eating from. It seems that drinking was the main activity. Or maybe the bowls for eating are made of wood and we don't find them. We don't really know. We might then ask, who was making these vases? Were they being made by artisans, by craftspeople associated solely with the palaces? There must have been artisans who did make special things for the palatial elites. But do these vases fall into this category? Or were they made by craftspeople who had a kind of flexibility too, producing for households and for funerals and for palaces? We can look at the techniques used, and there's definitely a high level of skill here, not only in the use of the wheel to make these vases with quite thin walls, and there's just some more parallels and a close-up of the interior of the vase here in the Rom. They have various features that make us think that these potters are making a lot of pottery and they have a high skill level. It's also about the firing technique, which would have been pretty difficult creating both a black and a red on the same vase. It requires a reducing atmosphere and an oxidizing atmosphere to produce the black and the red respectively, and to have a cycle between the two. So that's not at all easy. And Cretan potters at this time were amongst the kind of the best in the East Mediterranean generally. So that tells us something, but actually, when it comes to saying where people worked and their conditions, we know very little about workshop locales. We have next to no idea of the quarters in or outside towns where these craftspeople would have worked. So I showed you that kind of the vista of Knossos. There's a town there of 15,000, 20,000 people using pottery for most things in their everyday lives. We have no idea where the pottery was being made, which may sound a little surprising. It's really only at one site, Malia, which is 40 kilometers to the east of Knossos, so we have to just go to another site to get some evidence. Here we do see some workshops from this period from around 1750 BC. What we see here are a series of workshops clustered around a building complex. So here's the building complex. Here we can see how well preserved it is, and sort of vases just found on the floor. Here's a kind of a model to try and give a sense of what it might have looked like. But what we have are these workshops organized around these buildings. So there's a metalworker, potter, seal stone carver, and a couple of other workshops down here which were kind of multifunctional. So there's 5 workshops, like these ones, these buildings. And this kind of combination of different crafts suggests that there was a lot of interaction between, because they're all right next to one another, between the different artisans. So people who are working stone objects may also have been working ivory, wood. They would have been in contact with the potters, the metalworkers, who in turn would have maybe shared knowledge about pyrotechnology, how to fire things. And this interaction is quite relevant to the designs that we see, because much Kamares ware shows links to silver forms. And this is where there's a really interesting thesis by someone from Toronto, actually, Tanya McCulloch, looking at some of the designs on this wider category of Kamares ware with all kinds of embossing like this, mimicking classic kind of embossing patterns on metals. So there's a lot of kind of interaction between metalwork and pottery, which suggests, a kind of level of knowledge among the artisans, a level of interaction. It's also thought that maybe some of these Kamares ware objects have decoration that points towards textiles. So these objects come from a craft background in which many objects were being made for both palatial consumers and townsfolk, and with rich aesthetic connections across media. I would just say at this point that you can see, I think, that it requires quite a lot of background knowledge to be able to make sense of this one object held in a case in the ROM. It's not the sort of contextualization that all museum goers are going to get much out of. You can't be reading like all of this, like 3 pages, next to the case. You'd end up just reading something rather than looking at the object. There is a more visceral, bodily way of engaging with the object, which is to touch it and feel it, though that is obviously not allowed in the conditions of most museums. A child would come to understand the object in this way by handling it and figuring out what it could do. Might be able to figure out it's light enough to pick up, to handle, it's easy to lift and tip. If playing with liquid, the child may even try to drink from it, as the lip of the pot kind of allows that. It doesn't have to be only children that play. An adult may try to work out the object in this way too, if they could touch it. But failing that, perhaps one can do a fair job of imagining how it can be handled in the mind's eye. But is this what we do? Do we really stop to wonder how the object might have been held by someone drinking from it? This may seem like a straightforward step, and it is really, but you'd be surprised how little this happens. Let's just think where this path could lead us. Let's say we pay proper attention to its three-dimensionality and think about how it might have been used. It's a vessel that has a nice handle that invites us to hold it and pick it up. It has an open mouth, so one would have a good view of what's inside. It has a thin lip, and so it'd be quite suitable to bring up to the lips to drink. It could have contained about the amount we might drink today, if drinking wine, for example. Though we don't know what it contained, actually, whether hot or cold, alcoholic or not. It doesn't really have a glazed interior. There's no glazing of pottery at this time, though that black slip might have helped seal the contents in a little bit. So we have a person drinking something from a single cup, but this is a bit in a vacuum. It's pretty unlikely that the cup was the only object and the drinker was the only person. There were probably other things and other people around. Let's try to fill out the scene. First, the other things. Where did the liquid in the cup come from? It seems likely that it was poured from some sort of receptacle. And as luck would have it, we find plenty of candidates at the kinds of sites I mentioned earlier. The main candidates are on the right in what we call beaked jugs. They have enough capacity to fill more than just one cup. So we can project other cups into the scene too. And here's an example of pretty close to the cup we've got, and a jug that seems to match it in decoration, and so one can imagine sets of things as well. What's happening in this scenario with the jug and the cup? Is a different person pouring? So we're then thinking about a server and a drinker, and is the server of a different status? Seems possible, especially as the jug gets larger and larger. It'd be kind of hard to be sitting down and pouring from it. We can further expand. Where did the wine in the jug come from? Well, maybe that would have been decanted from an amphora, as on the far left here, which again has that same sort of polychrome design, and you can see it forming a set. And then maybe that was topped up and filled up from something even bigger, and we can talk about these jars, these pithoi on the right, from the same sort of time and perhaps working in a set as well. So we can think about webs reaching out, all these different kinds of pots that are implicated, more and more people, more and more roles, and one can start to see that single object in terms of these wider connections. We can also try to situate these actions and objects in a particular space. we could just pick one of the halls in the east of the Palace of Knossos. And actually, this set of steps describes what I'm now just starting to do with a team of students at the University of Toronto, to build an animation with an animator that's just started working with us, that could display just how such vessels could have been handled and used in social contexts. I would hope that such animations, maybe just 30 seconds long, could be visible alongside such vessels in museums to convey a sense of how they would have come to life in their original setting. And here, I'm just at the beginning of this project, and what you're going to hear in some talks later is work by people, especially from a French tradition, actually, and they've done all this kind of work. Bastien Roueff, for example, later will show exactly this kind of approach with animation and trying to place objects in a space and give a sense of how these things would have been experienced, basically. Having said all that, I can't help coming back at the end to a bit of sleuthing and trying to pin down where this object came from. It's in one piece, which is more typically what one expects to find in tombs rather than houses or palaces. We know of more tombs of this period, as I said, in the Messara near Festos than we do around Knossos. And we know that tomb looting took place on some scale in this area, dating back many decades. Furthermore, some of the better parallels are perhaps from the Messara. So on balance, it seems quite possible this cup comes from a Messara tomb. We may then need to reconstruct a funerary feast in our animations, even though consumption of these vases did also occur in palaces and in houses in their surrounding towns. So I hope that's given you some sense of how one object can be made to come to life with a bit of context, with a bit of animation. I'll happily take some questions now if anybody has any. Thank you.